Join us in Omaha, Nebraska on Saturday, October 7th, 2023, as I'm proud to present the most unique and important paranormal event in the United States this year, Historic Haunted Heartland Part 2, The Spirits Speak. Presented alive on stage at the Benson Theater in the heart of Omaha. The fun starts with renowned saxophonist from Colorado, Andrew Vogt, whose talents will help harness the psychical energy of the audience, living and deceased, to open a doorway for communication. Next, psychic medium Cindy Kaza will use her considerable gifts to invite these spirits forward to communicate with the audience in a psychic gallery reading. And finally, paranormal and occult expert John E. L. Tenney will offer his interpretation of these events and help us all make sense of what we have witnessed, as only John Tenney can. Tickets are available this summer, and I invite you to visit Necronomicast.com. Follow the show on social media for more information. Historic Haunted Heartland 2, The Spirits Speak. Brought to you by Necronomicast. Saturday, October 7th, 2023. A night that can change your life or your afterlife.
I'm Dr. Michelle Ward, and I'm a criminal psychologist and trial consultant. I've researched hundreds of murder cases, determined to find out what drives people to kill. But no amount of research beats meeting a killer face to face. Using techniques I've honed through my career, I'm going to take you inside the mind of a murderer.
From Omaha, Nebraska, the capital city of the historic Haunted Heartland, my name is Brian Corey, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this episode of Necronomicast. She has been called the real-life Clarice Starling from Silence of the Lambs and has starred in several crime documentaries, including Investigation's Mind of a Murderer and Stalked, Someone's Watching. Her name is Dr. Michelle Ward. Dr. Ward was one of the first scientists to identify potential future predatory behaviors in a population of children, and today she is widely sought after to assist in the criminal trials of some of the nation's most notorious offenders. But tonight, she is my guest on this episode of Necronomicast. We're going to talk about her new podcast featuring the crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer, how to spot a narcissist, a stalker, and even a serial killer. And now, calling in for a late-night conversation, the real-life Clarice Starling, Dr. Michelle Ward. Doctor, welcome to the Necronomicast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
I'm super excited. Sorry to interrupt you there. I'm super excited. I've been listening to your podcasts and the great programming on Discovery Plus, Investigation Discovery, about Jeffrey Dahmer, which is the subject of your newest podcast season, Mind of a Monster.
Yes.
I just even listened to the brand new episode today. It comes out on Tuesdays.
Yeah, I haven't even heard that one yet, so I'm super excited. This is season 4 of Mind of a Monster. And this season, we are covering Jeffrey Dahmer.
And just to recap, like season 1, you did the co-ed killer, Ed Kemper, with a little bit of Herbert Mullen thrown in there because they overlapped. Season 2, we had the Hillside Strangler, Kenneth Bianchi.
Mm-hmm.
And then I listened to the Ted Bundy, season 3, with some Gary Ridgway thrown in there, the Green River.
Right.
Oh my
we were
God.
kind of covering, for the first 3 seasons, we covered 2 serial killers who were killing at the same time in the same city.
Mm-hmm.
And or generally the same time. So what happens in those cases is either it confuses the investigation, it certainly increases the body count, but it also creates an ambiance of fear and copycatting that can happen. So it was a twist on your typical serial killing podcast, and it doesn't happen that often. But for these next 3 seasons, we've done more of a deeper dive into specific serial killers rather than comparing the 2. I mean, frankly, it just doesn't happen that often that 2 kill at once.
Right. And to prepare for this conversation with you, now, you hold a PhD in psychology from the University of Southern California.
Yeah, it's actually clinical neuroscience, which is housed in both the psychology department and the neuroscience department. So we have faculty for both. And that's because we do a lot of brain imaging, a lot of genetic testing, a lot of EEG work, psychophysiology testing. So it was obviously, because we're studying behavior, violent behavior, we need to understand the psychology behind it. But we also needed to understand the neuroscience behind it because there was at the time a paucity of research in that area. And it's a really important part. I mean, 60% of all male offenders in prison have head injuries.
Okay. Well, and you've devoted your research and professional consulting to the study of predatory criminals in psychopathic behavior. Now, I have not, so I really appreciate your patience with me with our conversation and everything, because I find all this super fascinating. Just just kind of on the outside of these things, just kind of looking in as a consumer of content and things. But this is like this is your passion. This is your career. This is your field of study and everything. So
yeah, most people don't study it, Brian. So please don't apologize for that. It is creepy as hell.
Oh yeah. Well, let's get into it. So 1992, 1991, I was in high school. And so, the story of everything about Jeffrey Dahmer broke out. And for me, it was like the first, coming of age serial killer in America for me. We had one in Omaha in the early 80s when I was a kid, John Jubert. I don't know if you remember him. Child killer. And so I remember, hearing on the news, Ted Bundy executed. I heard stories about John Wayne Gacy, but, Jeffrey Dahmer, that was, I'm opening up today's newspaper. I'm turning on today's news, and the scenes coming out of Wisconsin about Jeffrey Dahmer, absolutely diabolical. Doesn't even come close to describing his crimes.
Harrowing and so unusual, right? Like everything about Dahmer, his victimology, his psychopathology was unique. We hadn't seen the likes of him before, and we haven't seen since. And I remember I also was in high school during the time. And by the time I got to graduate school, I remember sitting with a professor and he's like, do not try to find a box for this killer. You won't. It's too unique. And several people I knew interviewed him. And, they really came up with this idea that a lot of it was his schizoid personality disorder that was driving these weird urges. Most serial killers enjoy the kill. Dahmer did not. He was killing for a very different reason.
And that came up like even in today's episode, season of this season, episode 4, you talk about how he was getting tired of killing, but he still had these urges and these desires and this drive to do these horrible tasks, I guess. But he was getting tired of the killing. So then he decided, well, maybe I can make an undead slave servant, and we'll get into that. But so it wasn't so much the killing that really energized him. It was just the control.
So you can have these killers with these paraphilic disorders, like Chikatilo, the Russian serial killer who killed countless people, mainly young girls. He could not, I don't know what this podcast is rated, but he could not.
It's for adults.
Okay, he couldn't achieve climax unless he was in the act of killing. So for him, it was purely sexual. That's not as rare as we want it to be. People who connect sex and violence. So that part's not unusual. He liked the kill because the kill helped him achieve an orgasm. Dahmer's slightly different. Dahmer was aroused by quiet, nearly comatose, very fit male torsos. That was his thing. We have not seen that before. It's really specific. It's very weird. So he really did try to avoid killing. He wasn't, he's no saint. He wasn't like, oh boy, I feel so guilty. If he felt really guilty about it, he would have sought help or ended his own life. Right. He wasn't very high on empathy and remorse. However, he was not devoid of it like most of our serial killers. He really, if he could have found a way to, still torture these people without their consent, without killing them, he would have.
Insane. So you were talking about earlier, you study like injuries, like, to people's heads, like head injuries. Dahmer, he got killed in prison, so we didn't really have a chance to really analyze him for that. But how does this begin? You do a good job of getting through his childhood, and he had a mom and he had a dad.
Right.
Dad, who I feel so sorry for, like during the investigation discovery, the thing that I saw on Discovery Plus, the companion piece, they interview his dad extensively, and he is so just wrecked throughout the entire thing. So he obviously had a father that cared about him, wrote letters to judges, sentencing his son on his behalf. Mom was in the picture too. So there wasn't like the stereotypical kind of things that you might think affecting Dahmer's childhood.
Right. We're always, I blame Freud for this. We're constantly looking for that aha moment in childhood to explain what went wrong, what set this person on the trajectory. Now, I say that with caution. There are traumatic events in childhood that absolutely can put somebody on the trajectory of criminal behavior. But more often than not, it's not that simplistic. The picture's quite complicated. So you have somebody with generally a predisposition toward violence, and then they're put in the right environment, they're given the right triggers, and a violent future emerges. Dahmer, you'll hear a lot of people talk about, oh, well, his parents were divorced. Okay, so line up, because half of the children growing up in this country have that same situation.
Right.
Or his mom was mentally ill. That's an important clue, because mental illness is highly heritable. She may or may not have taken complicated medications while she was pregnant, although the ones I could get my hands on, those were all, kind of prescribed liberally in those times. And we don't see a lot of Jeffrey Dahmer's coming out of it. There isn't an aha moment in his past. His parents did kind of abandon him when he was 17, when they got divorced and he lived alone. But all that did was give him more of a chance to hone the path he was already on. He was already, well into coveting and trying to find victims. So it's just not simplistic. I do believe that there is something to do with this schizotypal personality disorder that we have. You can have weird urges, paraphilic urges, other urges that can be born from that. And so I think it was a kind of a perfect storm. He did not, and those people have blunted affect anyway. They don't have a ton of, close relationships, remorse, guilt, empathy, those things that kind of make us human. So I think for him, it was a very unique combination of very weird sexual urges, the fact that he was homosexual, the fact that he ended up with a ton of free time because his parents left him his senior year alone in the house.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned homosexuality. Now, was it just because it was so taboo, more hidden, more, obviously it's much more open and it's much more accepted now.
Right.
Was it some of it out of shame that kind of made him kind of,
Go sideways? Sideways with it?
Yeah, like he was ashamed of it. So maybe some of that shame fueled some of his urges. And he was also a horrible alcoholic too.
Right.
So alcohol lowers inhibitions. Is there a combination of his mental disorder, shame, repressed feelings, and just drinking till the inhibitions are gone? Does all that kind of factor into it?
It does. In fact, I'd heard, I don't know how much of this gets into the podcast, but there was a lot of talk about he would have to drink in order. So he drank all the time. He drank in high school. He started drinking very young, but he would have to be very drunk in order to hurt people. It wasn't something he enjoyed doing. So he would drink himself deep into that. He said he drank to try to quell the urges, to numb himself. I think there was some shame and guilt about being gay, but I learned during my research that Wisconsin was kind of one of the most progressive, liberal, LGBTQ plus places on the planet at the time. And we have this wonderful historian who comes in and tells us about how far ahead they were compared to the rest of the country. So it was a relatively safe space, safe space. It was not safe, especially if you are, hanging around Jeffrey Dahmer. It's definitely not safe. But it was not as safe as it is now. It was not as progressive as it was now, but it was not as backwards as it was in certain places in the country. And, unbeknownst to Dahmer, in my opinion, his victims weren't often missed quickly because that scene, as progressive as it was in the bathhouses and et cetera, it was still relatively anonymous. People didn't use their real first names. So if, so-and-so went missing, it's hard to find that person because it wasn't their real name. Secondly, we're at the height of the AIDS pandemic. People were dying frequently. So it wasn't that unusual for somebody you're hanging out with to disappear because A, they've moved on, B, they've started a relationship with the person they met while you were there, or C, they've fallen ill with AIDS.
Interesting. I didn't consider that part of it. So he was living in a very crime-ridden part of town. His victims that he selected, I don't think it was totally random, like your podcast talks about, like how he sought out people that he could, that could disappear for a while. They might not be in the best relationship with their family, so it wasn't out of the question for some of his victims to be, to fall out of contact with their family for 2, 3, 4 weeks. So you take those crimes of opportunity, and he was a relatively good-looking guy, and I was amazed. Like, you always think cannibal, serial killer, weird, crazy, all this debauchery, but he was charming in a lot of ways. He really had no trouble attracting a young man and bringing him either to his grandma's house, where a lot of the crimes happened earlier, or later to apartment 213 in Milwaukee. Like, he was charming in a way.
Brian, and you're hitting two really important prongs of this. It's not only was he charming and not threatening. He did not appear threatening at all. Not only did he have that going for him in terms of luring victims, but he had that going for him in terms of how many times he slid through the clutches of the police over and over and over again. Often he's this upstanding, well-spoken young white man, and his victim is somebody of a different race who is drugged up at the time because Jeffrey has drugged them, and screaming hysterically that something has happened. And they believed him constantly. I mean, it's embarrassing when you read through it. And I've spoken to some of the detectives, and they're like, oh, no. It wasn't that unusual that he was believed. And I'm like, there has to be something to this, because the African Americans, the Black men of that area were describing to me, like, look, if we're walking down the street doing nothing, we get put against the fence, we get asked a lot of questions. Dahmer's walking down the street, they ignore him. He's in a predominantly Black and Latino area in Milwaukee, in a, kind of a rundown apartment building. It looks like, oh, look, here comes the neighborhood. Like, he looks like the last guy you're thinking that these officers are thinking are causing problems. I mean, they literally released a teenage boy, a very, very young teenage boy. I mean, was he even a teenager? He was so young, back into his custody. And these two women are going, are you guys nuts? This is a child. And they're like, stay out of it.
Oh, it's such a heartbreaking part of the video documentary of Mind of a Monster, where the lady who called the police to report that this 14-year-old boy was wandering the streets naked, bleeding, beat up, with a hole drilled in his head.
Right.
She's an African American woman. She's like 18, something like that, when she calls it in. And you guys played the 911 call. And the police come, and they don't believe the evidence of a 14-year-old bleeding, naked, beat up, drugged kid. They don't believe that, because she called it in, and then this master manipulator, this astute liar, comes in and says, "Oh no, this is my boyfriend. He's an adult.
Right.
Everything, I'll take
And Conrad did not look like an adult.
No, not at all. I mean, I have a child that's he's 14, and I so that really hit me. I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe that Jeffrey Dahmer approaches these two cops. And on the newest episode that just dropped today, you play the 911 call where the police are kind of making the report, and they kind of laugh about it. They're like, with these two gay guys, we have to get deloused after going to that apartment. I was like, like, seriously.
They're so disgusting.
Right. And it's just such an old boy network. My jaw dropped, because I can't imagine in any circumstance where somebody is, master manipulator, good looking, charming guy or not, but there's a naked person beat up on the streets of Wisconsin, of Milwaukee. And they believe this guy over the Black woman who phoned it in. And so it's so many times that these crimes just went through the clutches of the police.
Well, and it's your duty to protect and serve. Okay, so maybe you're on the fence. Maybe you're thinking this is possibly a relationship. Is there harm in taking this boy to the hospital? Is there harm in saying, heck, he doesn't have ID on him. You're saying he's over 18. He doesn't look over 18 to us. We're going to have to deal with this here.
Right.
It's one extra step. And that that boy may not have died. I mean, he did have a hole in his head, so I'm not totally sure. But his brother survived. Remember, his brother had been attacked by Dahmer.
Right. Yeah. That's why Dahmer went to jail for a little bit.
Right. Right. It's a really the layers. And I know that the police get a bad rap. And I don't, on any of my podcasts, I don't spend a ton of time tearing them apart because I know hindsight makes everything look so simple.
Right.
But there's just too many times in which he got away with just being a clean-cut white guy against the words of, a gay person of color or a gay drug addict of color. And they just, I know when you hear hooves, you're supposed to think horses, not zebras. But I'm sorry, these were all zebras. Like nobody took the extra step.
Right after his first murder in 1978, he had the body cut up and put in bags in his car, and he gets pulled over by the police then. And he's like, "Oh, these are I'm taking this to the dump. The dump was closed," or whatever the excuse was.
Right.
And they let him go. They let him
and
go.
He's drunk.
He's drunk in 1978, and he's like 18.
Yeah, and he's drunk.
Yeah, I don't like to throw the police under the bus. And in fact, many times when I have true crime experts on the show, I always try to paint positive the police because it's always like this great detective work. It's always like, like the diligence and the gumshoe detective who's got boots on the ground and drinking coffee all night, trying to, solve these crimes and all the diligence that involved. But when Dahmer was finally arrested, it was almost like by accident,
Mm-hmm. It was by accident.
Yeah, they go in there and they're like, "Oh, well, we take the guy back to the apartment. Oh, there's a knife there." And then they kind of look around and they find 80 Polaroids. And one police officer's like, "I think these are real."
Right.
Unbelievable.
Right. And it's, the new season we're working on now, I can't tell you the juxtaposition between the shoddy police work who aren't investigating, because it's sex workers versus these incredibly dedicated detectives who of their own accord and on their own steam and dime they knew it. They knew there was a problem. And you can't talk about the shoddy police work without shining a light on the heroes doing well above and beyond their own jobs in detective work and solving crimes. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Of course, just like any industry, you're going to get lazy police officers and you're going to get absolute heroic police officers. It's just in the Dahmer case, there aren't that many heroic ones.
No.
So it gets a little frustrating because, again, it's hindsight. Again, they did not have all the information. They're not expecting a cannibal. They're not expecting this guy. But he did get through a lot of police conversations without a second question.
Oh, absolutely. And back to the police, I interviewed a true crime historian by the name of John Borowski a number of years ago, and we were talking about Gacy. He's working on a Gacy documentary. And the police, they knew something was up with John Wayne Gacy. They followed him around forever, and they just didn't have that piece of evidence, but they knew because they followed and they did their research and they did their investigation thoroughly. I mean, they even had I remember him saying they had dimes and quarters in their pockets at all times because they wanted to go and call headquarters because they didn't have cell phones. They had to stop at payphones. And I mean, that's how they nabbed him, this diligent police work. So they, in Milwaukee there, plus, they were young guys, kind of transient, they weren't missed by the community much. It was anonymous sex a lot of times. There's a lot of factors and still, but a charming mass murder. How do you be charming at one moment and then drill holes in people's head the next? That's such a weird mystery to me that I can't wrap my head around.
And that's
how could you calm yourself down long enough? Like they show on your documentary, how do you calm yourself down long enough to sit and pet a dog that I saw in this video? There's Dahmer sitting at home and they're talking to him at Thanksgiving. He's just kind of petting an animal and just they're asking, "What, you been busy, Jeff?" "Yeah, I've been real busy." I'm like, "Oh my God,"
Yeah, I remember that. That's something I'm glad you're bringing up because Brian, what's so, it's well understood now in the research community, and I spend a lot of time trying to get these out on TV and podcasts, is there's a biological phenomenon with these serial killers. Usually they have low autonomic arousal. They have reduced anticipatory fear. And what I mean by that, I know it sounds fancy, but it's as simple as this. Okay. Right before something very scary is going to happen, let's say you're watching a horror film and the bad guy's behind the door, or In our case, we have set you up to a bunch of electrodes and we tell you we're going to shock you in 10 seconds and then you watch the countdown. Those of us who are normal and have normal autonomic arousal, we start sweating, our digestion reduces, our breathing increases, and our heart rate increases. We get anticipatory fear. We're fearful. That does not occur in a psychopath. So they are naturally calmer than the rest of us. They don't have those somatic, those physical markers to let you know, shit, you probably shouldn't be doing this. This is bad. They don't have to feel that way. It's uncomfortable as hell, and they don't have to feel that way. And the other side of that is not only do they not experience the anticipatory fear, the biological, markers of it, they also walk around under-aroused. So sometimes the reason they're committing the crimes to begin with is to increase their arousal. They do get a little bit of a high from it, and they like that because being under-aroused is uncomfortable. You're tired and bored all the time. So that's, to answer your question, that's exactly how he can pet a dog and chill with grandparents and then, cut somebody's head off the next day.
Yeah, and go to work all day at a chocolate factory and then...
With a head in his bag, by the way.
Right. Yeah. You guys make a good point of illustrating that fact in the podcast as well.
Just couldn't be away from his lover.
Well, let me ask you this, though. When they have a fear of anticipation, like we have this anticipatory, is that what you said? Fear?
Anticipatory fear.
Okay. Do serial killers have like a reactionary fear? Do they get scared? Like if they see a cop coming or the cop is talking to the 14-year-old boy in the street, or they come do they get nervous?
They get a little bit, but not like us.
Yeah.
They have a reduction in anticipatory fear. So that is exactly anticipatory fear. We feel like we're going to pee our pants. We feel like I'm driving down the street doing nothing wrong and I see a cop. I'm like, that's it. It's over. As if something's happening. They get a little bit of the anticipatory fear, but not like we do. Otherwise, they wouldn't do this stuff. It's too scary.
Is that a malfunction of something in their brain that doesn't, secrete that chemical that gives us the flight or flight response? Is it something like that?
No, they're actually born with this. Yes. So I studied this in 9 to 11-year-olds because I wanted to see if that lack of anticipatory fear existed before bad behavior started.
Or before
So
puberty?
I had to get them before puberty.
Okay.
Before puberty. Because that's when you start getting really naughty, right? Sometimes my 9 through 11-year-olds
speak for yourself, doctor.
just from what I've read.
Right.
So it turns out that even young children who are showing psychopathic features, even they have reduced anticipatory fear. They just are not as scared as their counterparts. You'll hear about those kids. I talk about that on my podcast, How Not to Raise a Serial Killer. You'll hear about these sensation-seeking children, fearless in sensation. The vast majority are not going to become serial killers. But having reduced autonomic arousal, I have it. So like I have anticipatory fear. That works plenty fine with me, but I have a very low resting heart rate. It takes a lot to get me going. But what interests me is pro-social behaviors, not antisocial behaviors. So I try to tell people, look, if you have a child who does not fear consequence, who does not seem scared of anything, and who doesn't have a ton of empathy, doesn't really care when their brothers and sisters are hurt, you need to start nudging them toward pro-social, exciting things, because you don't want them to go to the lowest hanging fruit, which is criminal behavior. And you can nudge them.
That's interesting, because that was one of my questions I was going to ask you about. How do you even treat this or diagnose it early? So, I mean, I guess it's just parents and teachers kind of notice these things. Like, how would you even get to a point where you would even start to, treat a child on your own, or with help from psychotherapists, or what are some traits that you would look for?
Well, that's exactly why these podcasts, I love podcasts because you can say so much on them. And this is all research we've had for a long time. And it doesn't get to the pediatricians, it doesn't get to the parents, and it doesn't get to the teachers.
Right.
So I spend a lot of my time now trying to reach that audience, because there are things you can do for, like I tell everybody, omega-3s, just you eat them, you force feed them into your children's diet, hand them out at preschool. They can't do any harm. They can only do good things. I mean, heck, they work for women in menopause, and they will help your 5-year-olds focus. The research is strong. But there are other simple things like that can't hurt your child, like biofeedback. If you have a child who is, running around, doesn't focus, can't concentrate, you can tell their frontal lobe is just so immature that they cannot stay on task. Start them with some biofeedback, totally harmless. And we can see the difference. You can see the waves in the brain that can measure the difference after 3 months of it. So there are things we can do if we start recognizing behaviors in children that are problematic. Again, I don't want to scare anybody because some of these problems that we see in childhood, they're normative. They're just young kids. They grow out of it, but some don't. So if you're seeing that if little Johnny is, a little naughtier, he's giggling when someone else is hurt. He's not very nice to the neighborhood animals. He doesn't seem to care. Jump in, lean into it. Don't be afraid. It's not your fault. Psychopathy is completely inherited. And maybe it's your fault because your genes, but it's not your parenting. And I try to kind of tell parents, don't take so much credit, but don't give yourself so much blame, because so much of what happens is us tacitly handing down genes, but we have tremendous power in what I call the nudge. Recognize who your kid is, get yourself informed, and nudge them to be the best version of their little selves they can be. I don't mean to sound like Oprah in that, but there is truth to it. So if you have a child who's pretty low on, I call it the give a shit factor, they're a little callous, they're unemotional. I'm not saying they're going to be psychopaths, but maybe they are. 1 out of 100 of us is. You want your money manager to be, you want your surgeon to be. Lots of us are psychopaths, right? I happen to be an empath, but I know lots of psychopaths. I keep them closer because I want to, know how they work.
Okay, hold on. When you say you want your surgeon to be a psychopath, like I might not know the right clinical definition of psychopath, but that doesn't sound right to me. Why would you want why would you want your bookkeeper to be a psychopath?
That's another one of those reasons why I am trying to disseminate information, because there's a lot of misconceptions. Psychopathy is very common, and most psychopaths are pro-social. They're not bad people. They're not hurting people. They're not committing crimes. And most of them, if they are committing crimes, it's white-collar crime. It's usually money related.
Really?
So, I always joke that Bill Clinton is like the world's nicest psychopath. He's not incredibly burdened by guilt, remorse. Maybe has some empathy, but he's just really goal-driven, right? And you kind of need that in certain professions. Like if there is a major trauma happening in front of you and you don't want your surgeon being like, oh my God, but it's just this little girl, and start like crumbling. You need your surgeon being like, hey, I'm going to do this. I'm going to fix this kid because of me, and I'm a star. It's not a bad feature. It really isn't.
Okay, so they're able to...
Of course, you don't want... Go ahead.
I was going to say, they're able to maybe compartmentalize?
They compartmentalize better, and they're just not burdened. There are people who argue, I am not one of them, but there are people who argue that the state of the personality of psychopathy is actually evolutionarily better. It's the direction we're going in, because things like guilt aren't fun and they do burden us. I think they're important if you're going to live in a society, if you're going to live in a communal organization at all, and if you're going to rely on each other, you need it. You need to understand, you need to care. But if you're a lone wolf and you're doing something that you're burdened by fear, like if you're a president of a country and you've got to drop a bomb, or if you're a general, you really can't be focused on guilt, remorse, and empathy.
You just have to make a decision, be able to roll with it.
Oh, so I say this because I have people who are like, come to me in shrouds and anonymous emails like, I think my kid's a psychopath. I'm like, lean into it. Just lean into it. You know what? You might end up with somebody's running a bank. Like it does not mean you're going to, especially if you have, if you're watching out for it and protecting them from trauma and protecting them from getting into the low hanging fruit of excitement like crime, you really might raise somebody incredible.
So we've got just negative cultural stigma to the word psychopathy or psychopath.
Right. They're not my favorite people to date.
Right.
You don't really I'm not saying that they're I know a few children who are low on empathy. They're super fun to talk to.
Yeah.
Do you want them to be your mother? Probably not. But they're not without an important place in society. And if we have this many of them, and we do,
yeah,
we have to kind of embrace it a bit.
How many serial killers do you think are out there? They say we have 350 million people out there in the United States.
In the United States.
Right. 350 million people. Is it thousands? Hundreds?
It could be. Well, I'll tell you this. In the United States, probably not thousands of serial killers, but in a place like Russia or India, I'm going to go with yeah. And
wow.
Sheer numbers is one part of it, but also there's just not a lot of keeping track of people, like in the lower castes, in the places with deep poverty. A lot of people die or go missing, and it's just like, fell in the river. So you can really operate for a long time quite prolifically in those regions if you're a serial killer. United States, we tend to count bodies better, at least than some other countries. So at any given time, it's hard to say. And here's another thing, Brian. We only study the serial killers we catch.
Right.
There are inherent fundamental differences between murderers who get caught and murderers who don't get caught. I was part of a study with Adrian Rain looking at violent criminals who had never been caught. And you might ask, what were you doing at 21 years old, hanging out with murderers who had never been caught? I didn't really know I was. We, believe it or not, these people were hired from temp agencies. I don't know how Adrian figured this out, but he figured out that a large number of violent criminals are at some point or another employed by temp agencies. And he got this certificate of immunity from the government. So whatever these men told us, he didn't have to report. And then he would throw them in MRI machines and measure their brains. I did the measuring. It was absolutely fascinating. And there are differences between, think about it. You're pretty clever if you're not getting caught. Do you know 1 out of 10, don't quote me on that, but it's something really high like that. I think it was 10% of the people we brought in from Los Angeles temp agencies had either committed or attempted to commit a very violent crime, like rape, armed burglary, or murder.
Are they attracted to temp agencies because they can't get employment someplace else? Is
Likely.
that part of it? Or they don't form commitments to jobs? Or what is it about a temp agency? They just need the money. And what is it about temp agencies that
I think it's because, I think the transient nature of it, the lack of commitment, the fact that they'll hire almost anybody and put you somewhere. There's some attractive elements to that. And if you're moving around, if you need to move around, you can always sign up with a temp agency.
Sure. Wow, that's insane. That's
Mm-hmm.
I never would have thought that. That'd be a great discovery if you're out there listening. ID, if you're listening, that'd be a good premise of a TV show. I don't know, following temp agencies.
I'm sure I pitched it to him at one point.
Right. Now, okay, so you spent time doing that, but I also, on your other shows, I see that you spend time with these violent criminals. You visit them in jail, you question them, you talk to them, and you are not scared to go after them. You're not like...
I am.
You are scared to go after them?
Oh, yeah.
One guy, I forget, it was I watched a bunch of them. So there was...
thank you.
There's one gentleman. There's one incarcerated individual where he said he's hit over, punched over 1,000 people, and then you said something like, "Could I be one of them?" And he just looks at you, blank stare. It's compelling television. Yeah, I probably could. He makes no, to sit across from somebody like that.
Yeah. Was this guy? His name's Tracy, I believe.
Yeah.
He scared me a lot.
Yeah, and he came I think he went to Columbia, or he had a really good.
Oh, you're talking about Jason Bourne.
That's the one. Sorry,
Jason Bourne. I love Jason Bourne.
Yeah, I just caught it on Discovery Plus.
Yeah, that was an incredible interview. I had just delivered a baby, and my baby was there. In all of those shows, I'm either pregnant or lactating. And I brought my babies with me from most of them, so that was always an extra element of fear. In that one, Jason Bourne was fascinating. He was raised by a schizophrenic grandmother. His mom is the CEO of I want to say it, but probably get sued, of the largest book company you can think of. She was the CEO of that, but kind of ditched her kids to go do that. And her children were raised by this schizophrenic grandma. Jason showed very clear signs of mental illness, but he was brilliant. So he goes on to become an attorney. I think he goes to Columbia Law School and works on Wall Street for a period of time, but he cannot control his violent impulses. And while I'm sitting there with him, I can tell that he's getting irritated with me. He's pissed. And so I kind of poked the bear there with him, and he's like, yeah, I could hit you. And I feel very strongly that he felt like he kind of wanted to at that point in the interview. In that moment, by the way, these prisoners, unless you're on death row, these prisoners are just cruising around the hallways like, hey, hi. And I'm walking around with a 120-pound unarmed guard who usually just leaves me there with my sound guy and a producer. So it's not the safest feeling I've ever had. And I believe that was Dannemora Prison, which immediately afterward, two inmates escaped. Remember that huge thing, that guard kind of let them out?
Right.
Then they were on the run in New York. But previous to that, they actually, I'm pretty good about grabbing my pen from them right as they signed the release. But I guess a journalist hadn't grabbed it quickly enough. And an inmate had held it to her throat and kept her hostage for a very long period of time, trying to get out.
Well, that's exactly how Hannibal Lecter got out. He stole
That's right.
Dr. Chilton's pen and used it to get out of the...
The rest is history.
Right.
That's right.
Right. But like, usually you watch a true crime show and if somebody's interviewing somebody, it's either behind glass or it's like Zoom or something like that. But you walk in and you're
I'm like hugging them.
And you're the one having, not a lawyer, not someone from corporate. It's you. Like, I need you to sign this release. So I don't know if that's...
Yeah, no, it's me. Yeah.
I know. I saw it. I was like, wow, this is like, you're pretty brave there, doctor.
Yeah. And I'm a girl and they haven't seen one in a long time. And like, there's so many elements of weird in it, but it was so exciting and so much fun. And I mean, I feel like because I'm not legal, because I'm coming in, I'm not a journalist, I'm coming in like I study this. Mm-hmm. I do feel like they opened up a lot more to me than they would have in a more clinical setting. I did feel like I got them to, it was fun. It's fun work. It's scary, but it's exciting.
Do you think they open up more because you are a female coming in there and they haven't seen one in a while? You know what I mean? Is it
could be
like
that.
They're showing off, because they know why you're there.
There was some posturing. There was definitely a little bit of posturing because they don't, like I said, they don't get to see women often, but also I'm not coming in a very intimidating fashion because I'm not their doctor. I'm not their lawyer. Mm-hmm. I'm just somebody trying to understand. And I'm not a journalist. So I think in some ways the conversations had a tenor of conversation that was different than what they're used to. And I felt like sometimes we would break down that barrier. A lot of them had an agenda. They wanted to tell me what they wanted me to know so that they could. And I'm also, here's the other problem. I'm a litigation consultant. I'm a jury consultant. So there were some who had done research on me. And they're like, hey, you can help me with my appeal. And I'm like, oh, shit, I can't. Sorry. And then I think maybe they got a little mad at me after that.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, bud. I'm not interested in taking up your case.
No.
So we've talked about this great podcast featuring the serial killers, including, like I said, this is coming out May 1st. So everybody that hops on my show right away and listens to it has at least 3 or 4 more episodes to catch up. So you can listen to episodes 1 through 4. If you're listening to this episode May 1st, the day it comes out, tomorrow the next episode comes out. But you've got this other podcast too. It is How Not to Raise a Serial Killer. And we did bring it up a little bit earlier, but I like the format of it because you'll go through like a crime, you'll talk about the serial killer, and then you usually have a guest on that's sometimes a friend of yours or somebody that's that has some knowledge. It's not somebody off the street but you have somebody on and you guys like have a frank discussion. And it's like the ones I listened to, I went for a walk the other day and I listened to a couple of them and it's you and your friend and it's just 2 ladies sitting there talking about a serial killer. And it's really compelling. Like you made my walk go faster.
Oh, thank you.
For real.
The goal there is, like I said, usually it's a parent I bring on. Sometimes it's not a parent, but the goal is to say like, look, we're all gobbling up true crime like it's our job.
Right.
But for me at this stage in my career, I feel like, well, we can't just enjoy it. We need to also understand how to prevent it. And we have just mounds of data that are so helpful that we can, really utilize at home. I just haven't found a place. If people want to pick up, JAMA or NIH articles, sure, but what mom does that? Right. So for me, this feels like I am going, if I die tomorrow, I at least have, a certain number of episodes where I'm like, okay, if your child is doing this, you can do this. If you see this, you can do that. Please these are your resources. These are your places to go. And this is what I think the listeners like is I can tell you why I believe this person became a killer. And then I'll tell you what to do if you're looking at that at home. So I love that. It's not, look, Mind of a Monster is so well produced. It's such incredible storytelling. Everyone at ID knows it's my favorite job. And so the How Not to Raise a Serial Killer is just kind of my own little pet project of like, okay, I need to add some vegetables to the true crime. And
to the red meat.
We got a lot of red meat in the crime. And I just want to be like, hey, people always say they want to know the why. Why did this person do it? So I give the why and I give what we could have done to stop it.
Yeah. Well, it's such great programming too. We got Mind of a Murderer, saw that on Investigation Discovery, Discovery Plus. Stalked, Someone's Watching. You have Mind of a Monster podcast, How Not to Raise a Serial Killer. Like multiple seasons, multiple shows, all this content. I was listening to one of your conversations on one of my walks, and you had somebody on, and you guys were talking about dating apps, and you were talking about like narcissism and like how to spot. And I found that so interesting, like the dating world. Now, I've been married for 19 years.
Good job.
Thanks. And we're doing fine. And so I can't imagine what it's like to date in the world of dating apps and swiping left and right and all this stuff. But when you guys are talking about these things, it's like so frightening. And you have all these great real world rules and advice that you go by.
Yeah, that's my girlfriend's show, Love Before 100. And I've been on it. I'm going to go on again. And she's on this journey to find love. And she brought me on to be like, well, what's the difference between like Prince Charming and a serial killer? I'm like, on a dating app, nothing. They look exactly the same.
Right.
And it's, I've been divorced and I'm getting remarried, and I haven't done a dating app because I'm just too afraid of them. But that's how people meet now. Like, that's it. And there's so many caveats. There's so many things you need to do to be careful. So it's an important episode.
Sure. Now Dahmer met people in a bar. So,
right.
I mean, it's not like I'm looking down on people at all that use apps. I mean, it's just the way it is. I mean, it's just
it's the way it is.
It's how you meet people. So, but I took a couple notes, like when I was listening, like, oh my gosh, I have to read some of these things that I pulled off your shows. Especially about profiles and people who are like narcissistic or borderline personality disorder people, and how it leads to stalking. And it's like people who are able to get information off of your profile, and they use it like to groom and seduce you. They're able to coax and groom you to find vulnerabilities and exploit them for their own good, and paralleling with other people in order to build rapport. It's frightening. Like some of the things you were going through, absolutely frightening.
Well, and that's how we get people to talk in an interview, right? You parallel their lives, you identify their vulnerability, you parallel their lives, and then they open up. And these really efficient daters, these guys who either are just looking to get sex from you or to kill you or whatever it is, not that those are the same. Sometimes we're all just meeting up for sex, right? On those dating apps. But they're not dumb. They become victimologists. They study that something works. So you put something on your profile and you're like, oh, lonely. And then it's like, okay, vulnerability. Oh, I was lonely. Yeah, I've had a bout with depression. Oh, I've had a bout of depression. They can identify people with certain vulnerabilities who might be more susceptible to going along with this person, to being love bombed, to taking a chance because of the love bombing. And it is kind of a grooming. And, I covered a killer who specifically killed people he found on dating apps. That is very rare. I don't want people to stop dating apps because it's a wonderful place to meet people, but just don't share your major weaknesses and your fears right away because people will, the criminals out there will exploit them.
Yeah, and they do so with razor sharp animalistic precision. It's insane.
Brian, I have to say, your research is the best I've had on a show. So my hat's off to you for really researching your guest.
Well, that's why I get all the good guests, Doctor. Let me answer this real quick. Like, last thing, we've been talking about all these serial killers and stalkers and psychopaths and narcissists and everything. Is it getting worse? Like with social media and just the access that you have to everybody and their lives? Like, with enough, noodling around on Google, I can find out, not me, but I mean, a person can find out where somebody lives right away. They can find out where they work. They can find out where they went to high school, college, who their mom and dads are, their cousins, where, what they drive. I mean, it's insane the amount of information that's out there if somebody just, looks.
No, you're absolutely right. It's not only getting worse, it's getting different. So historically, a stalker had to actually follow you around to really catch information. They had to befriend your friends. They had to know your routine. Now, I mean, with a first name and a description, I have friends who can find anybody. And it's even if you do a scrub on the internet, even if you do protect your anonymity, certain things are really hard to keep private. So yes, access to information, number one red flag. The other red flag, Brian, is we're all becoming minor stalkers, whether we want to admit it or not.
Guilty.
I mean, if you meet someone new and you're like, looking at their Instagram, like, well, who was this pretty girl they were with in 1999? And you go down the rabbit hole, and then you're kind of a flippin' scary stalker yourself.
Right.
And you can create all sorts of incorrect narratives based on what people put online. You can get in imaginary fights with people based on what they put online. You can foment that anger and jealousy and rage. Normal people. Now, those of us with properly functioning prefrontal cortexes right here behind our brain, we don't act on our impulses. But it's getting weird out there. It's getting weird, and that's never going to change. So we are seeing different kinds of stalking behavior. We're seeing it in children. We're seeing really dangerous things in the next generation.
Right. Oh my God.
Yeah. Just, to make it feel good about parenting today.
Yeah, right. Why is it predominantly men? Why, or is it? Or is that just a misconception?
No, it's not.
It's not.
It's not. No, we're just better at it.
Crazy ladies out there?
No, the women, I argue, yes, the vast majority of the homicides in a stalking situation are going to be by men.
Yeah.
Yes. But if a woman's going to do it, she's going to do it better. So a female stalker who decides to kill is so strategic and stealth and succeeds. So it's when you have, female stalkers can be quite deadly. But even if that's not their goal, they can be better because, first of all, the police don't take you seriously. If you, Brian, walk into a police department like, my girlfriend's stalking me, they're going to be like, oh, I'm so sorry, the hot chick's following you. They just don't take it seriously. Yeah. I can't tell you how many dead men were on. We did 58 episodes of that show, Stalked.
Mm-hmm.
I can't tell you how many dead men I had. And I'm like, oh my God, they tried. They asked for help and it wasn't there. It wasn't there.
Well, you see that like whenever a teacher gets arrested for having an affair with a student, like most of the time, if it's a woman, the guy's like, oh, lucky guy, lucky kid. Yep. And it's like, well, they are being sexually abused. They're being,
it's rape.
It's statutory rape is what it is. It's predatory behavior and it's sick and it's twisted and it's evil. It doesn't matter if she's cute or not.
No.
It's so weird. It's weird.
It's
so
disturbing.
That's why I wondered why, or I wondered if that was the case, if it was what the male to female difference is in that. So, wow. Well, and now just a little tidbit for your listeners. A lot of times when you have a female stalker, she suffers from borderline personality disorder. Think Glenn Close in Fatal Attraction. Right.
So they become very, very good at what they do. So yes, male stalkers sound really scary and they are more likely to kill you, but a female stalker is very, very dangerous. On that note.
Hey, thanks for listening, everybody.
It's a comedy podcast.
That's right. Next on the Brian and Michelle show.
Right. Keeping it light.
I've had just the best time talking to you. I did do a lot of research because I find it so fascinating. And because all the content that you have, these podcasts, whether on different networks or not, these different shows, everything that I've saw on Investigation Discovery and Discovery Plus, super fascinating. You do a great job. Having you on the show was a ton of fun and so informative. I would invite all my listeners to do a Google search on Michelle Ward and watch all of her shows and all her podcasts and all this material and content that you're putting out because it's compelling. It is entertaining, but it's also educational, and there's a lot to be gleaned from it, either how to protect yourself or how to recognize these traits in other people and just get a better understanding of what human beings are like. It's super fascinating.
Thank you.
Super
Brian,
fascinating.
that was the best press I think I've ever had. Thank you. I'm firing my imaginary agent. Thank you.
Well, I do the best I can, especially when I got, I look at your resume. I'm like, oh boy, I studied music in college. So how am I going to talk to somebody with a psychology PhD? You know what I mean?
Oh, I'm a goofy girl. Don't let my resume fool you.
I can tell.
Those are just names and numbers.
Well, it shows a lot of academic discipline, that's for sure. So I appreciate it, and I appreciate your time, and I appreciate all the stuff that you do, and the great team over there at Discovery Plus, Investigation Discovery, the Travel Channel, all the whole network.
They're the best.
Absolutely.
They're the best.
Great programming, great communication all the way around. So everybody, it's been my pleasure to talk to Dr. Michelle Ward, the real life Clarice Starling. Thank you, doctor.
Thanks for having me, friend.
There we go, everybody. Episode 248 of Necronomicast, featuring Dr. Michelle Ward, PhD. So appreciative of the good doctor for sharing her thoughts and sharing her time with me and all of you out there. Fantastic podcast, fantastic television shows over there on Discovery Plus. You can catch them all. Next up on episode 249, I feature a conversation with Steve Higgins. Steve Higgins runs one of the best, if not the best, paranormal website in the UK. And he's also written a great book, Hidden, Forbidden, and Off Limits, a subterranean journey into Britain's dark and forgotten places. That was a fun conversation. I can't wait to bring it to you in 2 weeks. Episode 249. Can you believe it? Hopefully you heard the commercial for the historic Haunted Heartland Part 2 coming your way. Brian, is it going to be streamed? Can I watch it on YouTube or TikTok? No. You got to see it live on stage in Omaha, Nebraska. Thanks for listening, everybody. Have a good night. Have a good life. Go get some sleep.